Hi, and welcome back to another video. And today I'll be talking about the UK local elections, which will be happening later tonight, and then they will go into the next day, which is tomorrow. Now, this is a video I wanted to make for about a week now, because I knew these local elections were coming up. For those who don't know, or who don't follow British politics very closely, the UK has local elections every once a year in the May of month. It's usually very early. They usually do it like on May 1st or May 2nd or May 4th around that time. However, today's May 1st, the local elections are today, and there's so much to talk about here. So these local elections are going to be the first big test of many world leaders. Obviously, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a leader of the Labour Party who has been leader for 5 years. He's been Prime Minister for less than a year, about, I'm going to say 8 to 9 months. Maybe my math's a little off, but he's been Prime Minister for about over half a year, half a year, um, or yeah, half a year, and he really hasn't. He's despite being an unpopular prime minister, he really hasn't faced another election since the Labour landslide general election win, when Keir Starmer and the Labour Party defeated Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives, who were the very unpopular incumbent party for many reasons. I'm not going to give them all, but mostly just for the economy crashing, high prices. It was getting really bad. Rishi Sunak wasn't able to turn it around, and they lost an historic landslide to the Labour Party, who at the time were the opposition. But now they're the incumbent governing party, and Keir Starmer is prime minister. This July will mark a year since he was first elected prime minister, and these local elections are really going to determine how the country feels about him, how they think he's doing as prime minister, and how they feel about his government. Now, we've seen polls where, right, the current Labour government is very unpopular. Now, if you look at the previous Conservative government, that was led by several British prime ministers, but the last three are the most important, right? Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, but mostly Rishi Sunak, right? Boris Johnson resigned in July of 2022, so around this time, Liz Truss took over, and then you see her when the government, the approval of the government collapsed under her, and then she resigned around October 20th, 2022, and that's when Rishi Sunak came in, and you kind of see that rise, but that's kind of expected when you see such a dip of approval. So the approval numbers they kind of go back up, as Rishi Sunak is prime minister here. But not enough. And it reaches an actual, high of -40. Now, as an American, this is not something, an approval our government would ever be seeing, right? President Donald Trump right now has a -4 approval rating. That is much better than, a -40 approval rating for a parliament government, a conservative government. But in June of 2023, this was the highest they ever got for an approval rating in the Rishi Sunak government. For the this is the Liz Truss government, got a all-time high of -37 until the economy crashed, and they got an all-time low of -76. But yeah, the Rishi Sunak government quickly came in, and things seem to be turning around, right? We got an all-time high of -40, still not as much as what Liz Truss got, but still, seemed to go going well for Rishi Sunak. And then eventually, about a year later, he called an election. He lost that by a historic landslide. Not with the economy just doing poorly, but the UK briefly entered a recession, and Rishi Sunak became an incredibly unpopular prime minister, especially since he was really an unelected prime minister, right? He called an election, and he lost that election. He lost the election to the very popular opposition Labour Party, which, when they came into office after defeating the Conservatives, right, the Conservatives leave office with a -56 approval rating, which is horrible. Now, when the Labour Party, right, comes into power here, they reach an all-time high of -2%. -2%. Now, they don't ever get into the positives here, same as you can see here with the Conservatives, but if you compare the Conservative government to the Labour government, getting an all-time high of -2%. That is a massive improvement than what we saw under the Conservative government. However, It's important, to realize here that they did sink, right? Negative 27, negative 35. But right now, they are really averaging here um, much higher than, the conservatives would get, right? We have right now that the Labor government has a negative 49 approval rating, which is bad. But look at this. Look what the conservative or the Labor government left with it, or has a negative 45. The conservative government left with a negative 56. This is still lower than what the conservatives had in their last couple weeks in office. And this is still, not as good as the highest the conservatives had, which would be maybe either negative 40 or when Liz Truss was in office, negative 37. But still, the highest Labor had was negative 2. Negative 2. And of course, now it has gotten much worse as the British people really are starting to understand Keir Starmer. They're either liking him or they're hating him. And as of right now, we can clearly see that the British people are not fond of Keir Starmer or what he's doing. Same as how they were not fond of Boris Johnson or especially Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. And yeah, we are really seeing the British people sour on all these prime ministers. They soured on Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and now Keir Starmer. So, and we have also seen before, right? These are going to be the local elections. We have seen in 2024 what happens when the British people sour on a prime minister. Which, as you can see here, the prime minister was Rishi Sunak. He was the last conservative prime minister. And look at how many seats he lost. Look at how many seats he lost. He went from 5,531 seats to 5,158 seats during these local elections. The parties that benefited were, kind of the Greens, but mostly, right, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, right? The Liberal Democrats, with Ed Davey as their leader, got 104, and Keir Starmer, I don't know why I blanked on that, as leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition at this time, got 187. This was the Labour Party became the biggest government for all these these seats and stuff being held they became the biggest local government. And this only really pushed the narrative that the conservatives were incredibly unpopular. Rishi Sunak was incredibly unpopular, and they would go on to have this massive defeat. And a couple weeks later, after this election, Rishi Sunak would go to call an election, and then 2 months after that, he would lose that election by a historic landslide. So, what happened to Rishi Sunak can happen to Keir Starmer. However, we do have a new conservative leader, as you can see here, Kemi Badenoch, who, if you remember watching some of my old videos, I reported when Kemi Badenoch was first elected as leader of the Conservative Party, which, if my memory serves me right, was in November of 2024. So Kemi Badenoch has been leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the opposition for quite some time now. However, there's been some conservatives that have been really souring on her, job as being the opposition leader. She's been struggling to really combat Keir Starmer in the prime minister questions. She really struggles to get her message across. And some conservatives are, expressing that maybe we went with the wrong person to lead the job. However, this local elections is not just going to be a big test for Keir Starmer, but probably more of a big test for Kemi Badenoch. Despite not being the prime minister and just the opposition leader, not only does she have to prove that she is, a much better person for the job than Keir Starmer is, but also Nigel Farage, who who took over the Reform UK party during the election campaign of June 3rd, 2024, when he took over the leadership. And Reform has been gaining mass popularity. And as a matter of fact, I do believe they lead... Oh, that's not what I pulled up. They lead first in these polling. As you can see here, this is the polling. Okay, so those are the seats. The polling is somewhere here. Labor. Yeah, Labor's in second place. 24%. Tories are at third. Yeah, and Reform here, is obviously at first here. So Reform leads in the polling. They are very popular. They appeal a lot to the far right, right-wing populism you've been seeing here a lot around the world recently. You probably would have saw it with Canada if Trump didn't get involved, and Pierre Poilievre maybe could have squeaked out a win. But unfortunately, that didn't happen with the Canadian Conservatives, right? They lost a couple days ago. But now you have reform, which Nigel Farage has received some criticism from Elon Musk. But despite that, nobody really from the Trump administration, the White House, or anyone who would harm him have really gotten involved. They really have not touched British politics. And I think it is because that Donald Trump does love Keir Starmer. They did that press conference and they hit it along very well. And so I don't think Donald Trump would, come and do British politics and endorse, Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage unless there was an election coming up, which there isn't. Despite the local elections, we are still 4 years away from another general election. So it's going to be a very long time until the British people, choose who they want their next prime minister to be. However, we have local elections every once a year in May. And now we have it again today. And it will be up to the British people to decide which of these people, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Reform UK, or the Greens, who they want to be leading in these, in these local government positions, who they want them to be in there, which party they want, to help with, infrastructure and all this other stuff, And if Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives fail to really perform well in these local elections tonight, if they flop, now they have a lot of good reasons to not do horribly. This is not going to be another local elections like there was last year, when Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives performed horribly. This local elections is the first local election in, I'd argue, 3 years where the Conservatives can perform well. But despite that, I don't think they will. They have reasons they could perform well, right? The opposition party, the Labour Party, is incredibly unpopular here. Look, they have a negative 49 approval rating, right? The Conservatives could argue, when we were in the government, when we were leading the government, when we were the government, things were going so much better. But I think the British people remember how much they soured on the Conservative government and say, no, we don't think so. And that's why I think when these elections happen, I think that Reform will probably perform the best, Labour probably second, either that or Liberal Democrats, and Conservatives probably won't do this well. Well, why, and you're probably wondering, why would you say that? They're the opposition, If they performed horribly last year, why would they perform horribly again? Especially with new leadership, especially now that they're the opposition. Well, because if you go, these local elections are now being taken place. Every time they take place, these seats that are up every 4 years. So the last time these seats were up was in 2021, where the Conservatives under Boris Johnson received their best local elections probably of this decade. When they gained 235 seats, Labour lost 237, and this is when Keir Starmer was only beginning. This was his first test as leader of the opposition when he was first elected as Labour leader in April of 2020, in the 2020 Labour Party leadership election. This was his really big first test because the local elections in 2020 were canceled due to COVID-19 restrictions. And the first ones for Keir Starmer being Labour leader, was in May of 2021, and Labour performed horribly. Conservatives did well, and obviously this was way before Reform came to place. And after this happened, Keir Starmer even thought about resigning as leader of the Labour Party. And if he did, we probably wouldn't have saw that big landslide that Labour was able to perform in July of 2024. But these races are going to be up tonight. This is the first time that these races, that Boris Johnson won bigly, the Conservatives won bigly. Now these races are up. Now because the Conservatives did so well in 2021 and Labour did so poorly, and because they gained so many of these seats, right? They won 2,345 seats. Labour only won 1,345. Because they have such a big margin, there is a lot to be taken away, especially if the Conservative Party has what they believe to be weak leadership of Kemi Badenoch. And yes, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, because they are the incumbent government now, there is a good chance that they could lose seats. But I think they have a lot less to, lose, especially if a lot of these seats won in 2021, 2,345 go to the Conservatives that are going to be up for re-election tonight. All of these that were won by the Conservatives will be up to challenge. There's going to be a lot of Labor candidates. There's going to be a lot of Liberal Democrat candidates, and there's going to be a lot of Reform candidates targeting these, all of these council seats that were originally won by Boris Johnson, the Conservatives. And it is Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives' responsibility to make sure that they don't lose these. And I do believe that they probably will. Now, if you look here, right? If you look here, right, it is a forecast. This is a forecast that the Conservatives, or other known as the Tories, will probably lose more than half their seats. In the 2025 English local elections, number of council seats forecast by party changes against national results of 2021. So in 2021, right, we saw the Conservatives gain the most. We saw the Labor Party suffer. We saw the Liberal Democrats suffer. Obviously, Reform Party wasn't around in 2021. Okay, others in Greens obviously did also, they're just the Greens. And now we could see the Conservatives lose a huge amount. We could see the Labor Party go up despite being the incumbent party. We could also see the Liberal Democrats go up again, and we could see Reform gain huge amounts. And only because we even saw in the 2024 general election that the Conservatives and Reform harm both of each other. Reform is one of the big reasons there is a massive divide within the conservative movement between the Conservative Party and the Reform Party. Both of these parties are determined to destroy and annihilate the other. Both leaders, both Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party, and Nigel Farage, leader of the Reform Party, have both refused to come up with some sort of deal or to an agreement, to really end this divide between these two parties. And as long as that doesn't happen, the Conservatives and Reform will continue to harm each other in elections. And I believe that's what we're going to see tonight. I believe that this forecast is correct, that the Conservatives will probably lose a lot of the council seats they originally won back in 2021. I think Labor will probably, also probably perform well. But if this wasn't 2021, for example, say if this was, 2022, right? If this was 2022, where we did see Labor perform pretty well, or if this was 2023, where Labor also performed well, very well, I think that Labor would be much more vulnerable, right? Because they gained all these massive seats. But because this is happening in 2021, because this is happening in a year where the Conservatives performed very well and Labor performed very poorly, I think that the Conservatives are going to be much, much more vulnerable. And I think tonight we are going to be seeing what this is showing. I think that the Conservatives will once again suffer in local elections. I think that Labor will probably do well, but I think Reform here is, set to do the best. As you can see here, this forecast has a negative 538 for the Conservatives to lose all those seats. They have for Labor to gain 72 seats here. They have for the Liberal Democrats to gain 104. And you have Reform, the most notable one. He gained 311 seats. This is the first local elections where Reform is up. Reform is projected to lead 311 seats. So that is huge. This is really the big test also for Reform, which it's expected Reform is probably going to do very well as well. But yeah, this is what we could see. This is what we could see on election night, or tonight. This is what we could see tonight, or tomorrow morning. But until the elections happen, until the polls close, anything could still happen. Anything is up for grabs. Maybe the Conservatives do well, but I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. They probably have a better chance next year in 2022, where the Labor Party performed much better, and they are probably much more vulnerable. Because they gained much seats, right? They won. Obviously a lot of seats here. But still, I think that if this was 2026, then Labor would probably be much more vulnerable, but it's not. It's 2025, and the Conservatives are probably going to suffer here. So, yeah. But anyways, that is the video for today. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will see you all in next video. Bye.